Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 138. Today's guest is Mel Thomas. Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today's episode is a KTCO Book Club conversation. I'll be talking with Mel Thomas about Holly Black's YA fantasy novel, The Cruel Prince. Mel Thomas is a media critic based in Louisville, Kentucky. They run a TikTok account focusing on the intersection of genre fiction, fan fiction, and traditional publishing. So when I reached out to Mel about doing a book club episode, they picked The Cruel Prince as the book we'd be talking about, and that was actually the first I'd heard of this book or series. In fact, I wasn't even really familiar with Holly Black's work in general. I'd heard of a few of her series before, notably the Spiderwick Chronicles, but I hadn't actually read any of them. I love being introduced to a new-to-me author, so this was a lot of fun, and as you'll hear in our conversation, there was a lot going on under the hood of this novel, something that I find is often the case with contemporary YA, and yet I don't see that discussed all that often. A couple of things before we get started. First, as always, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase your own copy of The Cruel Prince. I have included links from Carmichael's Bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky, from Mysterious Galaxy here in San Diego, California, and from bookshop.org. I also highly recommend ordering it from your own local independent bookstore. Second, Mel is one of my favorite book talkers. I always find their discussions of books and fanfic to be insightful and interesting, and there's a link in the show notes to their TikTok page. I highly recommend checking that out as well. Finally, as always for our book club episodes, there will be some spoilers in the discussion. This particular conversation is a bit lighter and more circumspect about spoilers than we've done before, but if you want to go in completely fresh, then go ahead and pause the episode and come back after you've read the book. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Mel Thomas about Holly Black's The Cruel Prince. You know, I enjoyed this book quite a bit, and I'm curious what it was about The Cruel Prince that made you want to pick this for our little book club discussion.
Well, I've been thinking about doing a long form kind of piece on it for a while, but can't quite get my act together. I think I'm really interested in the disconnect between what I see as the popular kind of perception of it, like on Book Talk specifically, because that's kind of my spot, and like what I think is like the very real quality of the book and like the themes that it explores and like the story it's telling. I feel like there's a disconnect there, and I've wanted to kind of talk about like why that might be and where it's coming from, I guess.
Interesting. Yeah. Just sort of along the same lines, in preparation for this conversation, I went out and looked around a bit to see what the coverage of the book had been sort of in the critical space. Mm-hmm. And there were really not very many professional reviews of it, which I thought was kind of surprising for an author of Holly Black's. I mean, she's a very prolific author.
Right,
she's a very popular author. She's a very successful author, and yet there were very few professional reviews, and most of the fan reviews, I mean, we can talk about this a bit more, but I thought they weren't really engaging with the text in a way that I found very interesting. I don't know if that's like kind of condescending or not. But
right. No, I know exactly what you mean. Yep.
Yeah. So for the listeners, we should probably give a little intro into what the book is and what it's about. Would you be willing to give a little bit of a summary?
I can give it a shot. Okay. I'm like notoriously terrible at summaries because I tend to go down like little rabbit holes, so feel free to interrupt me. But I mean, the premise is like, you know, there's a fairy world and there's like a real life mortal world sort of existing parallel to each other. I think it's like set in Maine, actually. I'm not sure they mention it in this book or if it's in one of the other ones. It's in like, I'm already doing it. I'm getting off track. But like the premise is three sisters are sort of whisked away in early childhood, kind of like a fairy tale, like a dark fairy tale, to live in fairyland. And two of these girls, including our protagonist Jude, are mortals, living in like a world actively antagonistic toward them, and they sort of have to figure out how to navigate that. And the book is specifically in first person. It's about Jude trying to figure out how to survive and then eventually thrive in this world, like designed to put her down, basically.
Mm. It's an interesting thing. Like, I think that you're right in saying that she is trying to figure out how to thrive in this world. I think it's sort of an interesting question to ask, like whether or not she is thriving.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe thrive isn't the right word. One of the most interesting things to me about this book is like kind of how unreliable of a narrator Jude is because of like her hypervigilance as a trauma response, I would say. Like she's learned to survive in this world by like being very aware, by training herself and like through her like foster father training her to be like hyper vigilant, like ready for threats at any time. And like it's really interesting to see the ways that has really kind of biased her person. Like she tends to see like the worst in people first. And she sees like the world as like a really ugly, scary place. And it often is. Like she's often right, but sometimes she's not right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that tension is interesting to me.
So the book starts out, the prologue, which is the only part of the book which is written in third person, which I thought was kind of interesting. The prologue, she's 7 years old, and this fairy general, Maddox, comes to her door and basically murders her parents and then takes her and her two sisters, her sister and half-sister, away to fairyland and raises them. Then 10 years later is when the meat of the book starts. So this whole question of like why people are the way they are, I feel like is kind of a central theme of the book, because I mean, obviously we see everything from Jude's perspective through the book. It's in first person present, like a lot of YA novels are. And so we're given this really close look at how Jude thinks and feels about the places and people and world that she lives in. But I feel like a lot of the rest of the book is sort of whether or not she sort of knows it, but like Holly Black definitely, I feel like, is asking us to consider why the characters are the way that they are, especially the character of Carden, who is sort of one of the main antagonists through the book. How does that sound to you?
That sounds about right to me. Carden is like, especially in this book, and I do sort of like not regret exactly because I'm not sure I'm really in the headspace to reread all three right now, but Carden is like one of the least interesting parts of this book. To me, he gets really interesting, I think, and that is like people who are engaging like with like more serious criticism with this book. Carden is like, I think, a point of contention for them because he is just sort of a bully. I struggle with like how, in this reread specifically, I struggled with like how quickly Holly Black is wanting us to sort of to consider his point of view, in my opinion, like a little too early. Like I'm going into mild spoilers here, but like he does like modify his behavior in the later books. And then we get to really see like kind of why he is the way he is. And like that progression is a little more interesting to me. So I think a criticism like I have of the first book is like maybe it's happening a little too early. I think that Holly Black wants Jude to sort of reconsider how much power she's kind of given to Carden in her own head, and also like sort of the malice that she's like ascribed to him. But I also think she has like really real, at this point, has like really real reasons for like being afraid of him, for not trusting him. So I kind of feel like that happens like a little too soon. But also, like, it's very self-aware, you know what I mean? So those are my thoughts on Carden.
I think one of the things about this book is because it is written in such a close first-person perspective, it would be really easy to sort of conflate the opinions of the author and the opinions of the character. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And obviously, Jude has really strong feelings and opinions about this character of Carden, who he bullies her. And you know, I was bullied a lot when I was a kid, and this is like quite next level.
Yes.
What's interesting is I didn't quite know how to feel about how the book treats that character, right? Because on the one hand, we spend most of the book just seeing the ways that he is cruel. And I think most of the people I've seen talking about this book interpret the title to be talking about him. But through the book, you're given these opportunities to see that he is as traumatized by his environment and upbringing and the people around him as Jude is. I'm saying as traumatized as. I'm not sure that making that comparison is quite apt, but to say that he is also being traumatized by his family and the sort of structures that he's in, not to mention the fact that a lot of his behaviors towards Jude you're given reason to see them as sort of like a sublimated, he has like a crush on her kind of thing.
Right.
I'm not really sure how I feel about that, you know, like, I mean, it's such a strong trope even in real life to say, oh, like that boy was mean to you, like, so he probably likes you, without really engaging with whether or not that makes it okay, you know? Mm-hmm. And I feel like this book also, I haven't read the sequels, so I'm not sure how that plays out later on, but at least in this book, there's not a lot of time spent on that. It's more kind of like Jude finds these things out and she isn't quite sure how she feels about it, but her opinion of him seems to switch fairly quickly. Is that your read as well?
Yeah, that's my read as well. Yeah, it's tricky. Like I feel like Holly Black is trying to suggest that Cardan and Jude, like their place in like this in fairyland is sort of more equal than it actually is. And it's kind of messy because it's not. Like humans are like the like oppressed class in this world, and Cardan is like literally a fairy prince, and he is like abused by his family, but he still has like a tremendous amount of power and social status and like literal like magical power that mortals don't have. And so I do feel like as the books go on, it is sort of suggested that like they're equals in this way, because like part of Cardan's fixation, and I do like I agree with like your kind of trepidation about boys will be boys. He's acting mean because he likes you. I don't generally like that. But in this like case, I think her, regardless of like the symptoms of how like his fixation shows up, I think his fixation kind of makes sense, because as we go on, we learn that, you know, Cardan is like physically abused. He's like severely emotionally neglected. He has like no like real parents to speak of, no one who like, no adult figure who like cares about him. And so he looks at like these mortal girls who he's taught are like everything less than him. Like he should be able to step on them. And they have like this like admittedly like very complicated kind of love from Madoc, but like the fact that, you know, he does love them in his way as he knows how to do, like that's visible to everyone, and it's visible to Cardan, and that's sort of like the root of his fixation. And so it's sort of like Holly Black is kind of suggesting like kind of a yin and yang thing. Like she has like this privilege because she has like this family and she's in the gentry and she has like a family who loves her, and he has this because he's like a fairy, but he doesn't have anyone. And I don't feel like that quite syncs up the way that maybe she intends it to, because I think that, you know, Cardan does still have the power in this situation, regardless of like his tragic backstory. So I feel kind of complicated about sort of as the books move forward, sort of not the justification of his actions, but sort of like, oh, you know, he acted this way because of this. And yeah, accountability would be good. I don't know, complicated feelings about that.
Yeah. I think that it was really interesting sort of to go back to what I was saying about the sort of fan reviews that I had been reading. I was really surprised that, well, first of all, a lot of the fan reviews, and I know this is just sort of how a lot of people engage with fantasy and YA in particular, and there's nothing really wrong with it. Like people can engage with texts however makes them happy. I feel like a lot of the fan writing about it is sort of focused on whether or not they like Jude and whether or not they like Cardan. And the people who like Jude say things about her like she's brave and she's fierce and cunning. And one person I remember saying she stands up for what she believes, which I was like, I don't know, you know. And if they don't like
her, she believes in murder.
Yeah, if they don't like her, they'll say that I couldn't relate to her, or she makes poor decisions, or she's violent, or, you know. And then like with Cardan, I was actually reading one this morning shortly before we started this call, and I was just, the person was sort of taking it as a sort of traditional enemies to lovers romance story. And I don't know if that's where it goes later in the books, but it was just really surprising to me. There was even a line about, I wasn't sure about him at first, but now he's my newest book boyfriend. And I thought, oof.
I'm generally uncomfortable. I've also seen some, I don't know, book boyfriends in YA books. I don't love that framing. And with Cardan in particular, because I see him as like such a child. Like, so with him in particular, I just really hate that framing so much. But I've seen it before too, and also in fan reviews. So yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Like I say, I mean, people can read however makes them happy to read. But I do kind of feel to some degree like it may be doing a bit of a disservice to the book and to Holly Black as an author to sort of just engage with this story as, do I like these people or do I not like these people? And I know that that's sort of like a really, like that's a thing that lots of people have talked about a lot, you know, with a lot of different kinds of literature. But I do feel like Black is trying to set up something a little bit more complex than that with these characters. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Like, yeah, framing it as enemies to lovers, I feel like, well, I don't love the trope first framing, like, ever. Like, I'm just kind of a snob about that. I find it to be, like, generally pretty reductive, because I think most stories are more complex than that, because part of the point is, you know, Jude's never Carden's enemy, and sort of untangling that and unraveling that and like figuring out, especially like considering this is like a teenage girl, sort of unraveling how the world sees you and realizing that kind of the way you center yourself, like as an adolescent, can be kind of like myopic and kind of like intense, and it doesn't really like reflect reality. Like, oh, like this guy's my enemy, and we're gonna, but that's not really what it is. Like Carden has a crush on Jude, and it's like it's a bully crush, it's a bad crush. And as the books progress, in The Wicked King, kind of the core conflict is Jude trying to, like, they're trying to be on the same team. Like, neither one of them, like, wants to hurt the other. It's not, and like, they're trying, but like, the problem is that they can't shed their armor. They can't get rid of their baggage enough to like truly trust each other. So when there's like these twists and these betrayals, it's not coming from like an enemy's place. It's coming from themselves. Sorry, I'm being vague because like I haven't read The Wicked King in a while, but like it's not, when like there are these twists that happen, it's not because like the other person betrayed them like an enemy would. It's because there's like no trust there. And how do we build that like in this world where we're supposed to be enemies, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That thing you said about teenagers being myopic, I feel like that is a sort of a real driving force for the structure of this book.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's necessarily, I mean, there are certain plot elements that definitely rely on it, but just as the book is structured, a lot of it has to do with the fact that Jude really has no idea what's going on around her, but she feels like she does. Mm-hmm. There's something about that, you know, I'm 43, but I don't feel like being a teenager was that long ago. I mean, I like literally was a long time ago, but it doesn't feel like that long ago. And coming to a book like this, I thought that was handled very skillfully. And it almost feels like in some ways, I hesitate to say that it's the point of the book, because I don't think any author really usually has a single point in making a book, but it is there's so much that has to do with the fact that Jude is a teenager that I feel like that theme of like teenagers kind of feeling like they know more than they really do seems important, you know, but it's also not done in a condescending way, which... No, and
that's what I love. That's what really stuck out to me in this reread, is how like uncondescending this book is. And like paradoxically, I think that's what like makes, or not but you know, I think that is the quality that makes people kind of dismiss it, because it's written in like kind of the language with the dramatics that like a teen girl or a teenager would understand. But I think that sometimes when like adults read it, they sort of kind of roll their eyes at it. I really appreciated that quality this reread.
You know, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I think in general, YA tends to get sort of short shrift from the sort of critical establishment, even within genre fiction. I mean, obviously, we all know that there's like this. It's not exactly a feud, but there is sort of this entrenched tension between the literary fiction critical community and the genre fiction critical community, where neither side really seems to respect what the other is doing. You know, I mean, obviously that's like not true in all cases. Like lots of people are perfectly happy to treat both sides seriously. But even within genre fiction, even within science fiction and fantasy, YA tends to be particularly dismissed.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was thinking a lot about as I was reading this, and indeed as I've read a lot of YA over the past, I don't know, 5-10 years, is like, why is this YA? Right? Because like the book opens with a brutal murder. it's largely about people dealing with different kinds of abuse and trauma. It's a really, like I thought, a really, really good depiction of, you know, that hypervigilance that you were talking about, that like anybody who has grown up in an abusive environment or seen somebody grow up in an abusive environment knows that that's a real thing. And it was handled in such a realistic, but also kind of subtle way. And I mean, these are fairly heavy themes, and they're handled with a certain deftness that doesn't really call a strong attention to them. So what is it about this that makes it for young people? You know, like when I was a kid, when I was like in middle school or whatever, I, you know, being a pretty typical middle school aged boy fantasy reader, I read a lot of like David Eddings, say, and people can talk about like whether or not David Eddings' books hold up or whether or not they're like of good quality or whatever. To me, that's less interesting than just the fact that when I would go to like the Walden books at the mall in my town, those weren't in the young readers section. They were just in the regular science fiction and fantasy section, you know, even though they share a lot of the same things. They have a young protagonist. They're not like terribly, in a lot of ways, they're a lot less complex than this book, you know, but those were marketed as normal adult fiction.
I'm actually curious about that, because do you think, I was just talking to my husband about this the other day, do you think they were? I mean, I wasn't alive when the Belgariad, is that what that series, the David Eddings series? Because I asked, because I'm a big Ursula K. Le Guin fan, and when A Wizard of Earthsea came out, like you find that in the adult fantasy section now. Like if you walked into a Barnes and Noble, that's where it would be. But it was like broadly considered YA, like scare quotes, because like YA wasn't really a thing, not the same way like it is now. And I'm kind of curious about that progression of genre fantasy, like in particular, because it feels like fantasy kind of used to be more YA oriented, or more like general audiences, I guess I would say. And as in the past like 10, 20 years, it's really like bifurcated. So now you have like adult fantasy, and it's expected that adult fantasy have like lots of sex and murder and drugs. I said not judgmentally. I like reading about all those things. But then like YA, which is dealing like much more like explicitly and intentionally about like coming of age and having like these young, like a young wizard. Now, if you have a protagonist that age, he would like be in YA. As kind of like the trend that I've observed, and I'm kind of curious about how that's progressed and like how that's affected like what gets published where. I don't really have an answer, just like just a stream of consciousness.
I don't really have an answer either. I mean, but you're right that you know, like when I was growing up in the like 80s and 90s, there was definitely not, like you had children's books and then you had adult books, and there wasn't really a focus on young adult reading. And or even now where things are separated even further, where you'll have children's books, middle grade books, YA, and then adult fiction. And to some degree, it's all like largely driven just by like as a marketing thing, right? Is my understanding. But it's just a question of like, what are the publishers going to be pushing as YA or as adult fiction, right? Like I remember, this was a while ago now, probably 10, 15 years ago, something like that. I was reading this book by Nicole Corner Stace. I think it might have been her first published book. It's called Archivist Wasp. And I was reading it and I was like, it's a science fiction. I don't remember the story that well, unfortunately, but I just remember as I was reading this, I was like, why was this put in YA? This is like really dark. This is really heavy. It's also like kind of brutal in the way that like approaching ways, like, I don't know if you've ever read, Cameron Hurley's books, but like, you know, Cameron Hurley is an author that I associate with like a really sort of brutal aesthetic in her work. And like, there's nothing about this book that I would consider to be even necessarily appropriate for young readers, but it was listed as YA, and really only because the main character was a teenage girl. And it just seemed like such a strange thing to me, you know?
Ding, ding, ding. Yeah, I think you really nailed it. The last little part there, I think, because it was a teenage girl. I think that's probably why, because we can't expect adult men to be interested in the silly little pursuits of teenage girls. I think that's obviously like part of it. I don't know, though. I guess, are you Are you saying, I don't know, is there like a tonal constraint? Like, should YA books only be so dark? I kind of respect that about The Cruel Prince, but also like I'm 33 years old, so like I can't read it like as a kid. It wasn't around when I was a kid. Like you, like when I was growing up, like in the 90s and aughts, there was not really like YA. Like YA was like those the Scott Westerfield books, and like it was really, or it was oriented like towards like kind of high school girls, or it was like a little closer to like children's like middle grade lit. I guess because I'm kind of worried about sort of the state. I'm worried about the state of YA. I'm worried about like the state of books and sort of kind of morality stuff, I guess. I read a lot of YA that leaves me feeling like, oh, like this is very prescriptive. Like this is like a manual on how to like live your life as like, listen up, young person. So I really respect YA that deals with complex, dark stuff in a way, like we were saying, that doesn't talk down to its readers, because complex, dark stuff happens to kids. And I think that books are an important like vessel for them to have to like explore that. But it's hard because like I'm not a child psychologist. I don't know. I don't know what's appropriate and what's not, or like where the line should be. I have no idea. But like the more YA I read, especially like in this climate, the more I respect YA authors who like trust, who clearly, number one, understand their audience, and like two, trust them to like trust young people, trust young girls in particular, to like be able to parse complex, dark stuff sometimes. But I'm not like I said, I'm not a child psychologist. I don't know where the line should be. I don't know how much murder, I don't know how much murder should be acceptable in like YA fantasy. I really don't know.
Well, I don't mean to be sort of like moralistic about it exactly,
right?
Because I mean, obviously, if for myself, if I were to look over my own reading history, I was reading wildly inappropriate books at a very young age. Like I was reading like the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, when I was in like first grade, which I'm really kind of surprised that my mom was okay with.
Right? I have those like memories. We had Stephen King and John Grisham just in our elementary school library, and I just went because there weren't like YA books. So like once I was done with the Boxcar Children, like once I was ready for like more adult stuff, like that's what was there. It's kind of wild to think about in hindsight.
Yeah, I was actually not just like stealing them from my mom's bookshelf, but it was like she knew that I was taking them and she was fine with it. She didn't care what I read. So I do think that people can be very condescending towards young readers when it comes to, or just not young readers, but young people in general, in terms of like teenagers or even children's ability to have complex inner lives. And so to that extent, I think that it is important for young people at all ages to be treated with a certain respect and seriousness. And literature is no less part of that, in my opinion. So I agree with you on that part. I guess what I'm saying, like when I said, like, I don't know if this book is appropriate for younger readers. I mean, first of all, YA traditionally is aimed at like high school and maybe college age readers, not like, young children. So that's part of it. But I guess the question for me is not whether or not it's appropriate for like, from like a parental standpoint, like, do I want my child to be reading this? But more just like, why is this a book that you as a publisher are pushing towards a young audience, as opposed to, I mean, because a lot of things, it's not a question of like, do I want my child to be exposed to this? It's like,
why wasn't this an adult book? Like, why did Holly Black not want to write this for adults? Because it's a story with like pretty adult content. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So like this book, I think some of the nuance to this book might be, and I don't want to be condescending, but I feel like some of the nuance to how this book is written and what Holly Black is doing with perspective and how she builds her characters might be a little bit lost on someone who doesn't have a sort of more adult life experience and has grown through an adolescent phase already, not to say that all adults do. I
don't know. I kind of think that's like a consequence of good art. I think you're like totally right. Absolutely. I think that the nuance is lost on like you said, I've also looked at fan reviews and I see a lot of like the most interesting and complex stuff in this book, like totally go over people's heads. But like you could say the same thing about 1984, which is like a book for adults that I see mostly adults talking about who like clearly don't understand kind of what that book is trying to explore. And I don't know. I don't know. I think that sort of, I think we have to live with that when we make like good art. I think it sucks and it's like really frustrating. I don't know. I think that's just good art has to be like that. Otherwise it's didactic, right? Like otherwise it's preachy. It's like if you're trying to.
Yeah, of course. And you know, any kind of art, you can't control what your audience is going to be bringing to it in terms of either like what critical lens they're going to be approaching your art through, or like what sort of just personal baggage each person is going to bring to their experience of the art. But for me, I mean, I guess I can't speak for teenagers in general, but I know that when I was a teenager, I would have read this book really differently from how I'm reading it now.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I think that also I want to like put the marketing of this book on the hook too, and like the comps. Although I haven't actually, I want to take that back because I haven't looked at the comps. I'm ascribing like a lot of like kind of fan promotional content to like the official marketing, and I'm conflating those two for sure. But even like the first time I read this as an adult, like as a 30-year-old, I had like a very different experience, and it wasn't until like I was reaching like the end of it that I kind of started to like pick up on some of the stuff that I should have picked up on to begin with, specifically because like I was looking for the stuff like with Carden, like I was looking for this romance because that's like typically how the book is kind of pitched, and that's sort of what the marketing material and kind of what the title would lead you to believe. So even like as a full-grown adult, like me reading this book for the first time a couple years ago, I feel like I missed a lot of stuff because I was like specifically like I was primed to be tuned in to like this thing, this like romance, which is like important. Like I don't want to diminish it, and like it's fine to be interested in romance. I love romance, but like that's not really sort of the most interesting stuff that's happening in this book. And I thought I was even able to like retroactively realize that, but on this reread I realized like frankly how much I missed, and that's like as an adult. So I don't know, I want to put marketing on the hook too, and like the way this book is like talked about broadly, that just kind of misses the point. Yeah, I guess.
I mean, to me the romance aspects of this book they're certainly present. And I assume that there's going to be more of that developed in the sequels. Yes. But it's not what the focus of the narrative is. So, no. Like, I mean, again, like people are going to latch on to whatever they latch on to. And definitely like a big part of how we interpret any work of art has to do with the sort of like context, and genre is nothing if not context. But it was just surprising to me that so many of the fan reviews focused so much on the romance part, because, I mean, even just in terms of word count, I feel like, you know, Holly Black just isn't spending that much of the book talking about that aspect of it. I mean, it's there, but it's not like, it's not where she's focusing her attention. Am I off there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, you're right on the money. I would say I totally agree. And honestly, like the secondary, the kind of the red herring love interest gets, I would say, more words and more attention in this book. I'd actually kind of forgotten that. That's another thing I noticed in this reread. I kind of forgot all about Locke.
Oh yeah.
And he really gets kind of more attention. I think more words than Carden does in this. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting what people latch onto. I think it has a lot to do like with ACOTAR, not to throw ACOTAR, A Court of Thorns and Roses, not to throw it under the bus too much, because I think that people kind of ascribe a lot of problems with fantasy romance to it specifically. But like in the comps that I've seen, people are like, oh, you like ACOTAR? Then you like this, because it's another fairy story with like a dark-haired love interest. And it's like, oh, yeah, but there's like a lot of other stuff going on too. But it's interesting, like if you go into a book, like reading it, expecting like certain things, I do think you sort of put like blinders on to other interesting stuff that happens sometimes. If you go in like looking for the dark-haired love interest and like that's all you see, then that's all you're gonna see.
Yeah. Although I do think that one of the interesting things that genre, like how genre functions in general, is to set up certain expectations for us as a reader. And then whether or not it plays towards or deviates from those expectations, the sort of genre expectations, is a lot of times what makes a genre story interesting, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I do think Holly Black is like actively in conversation with like the dark-haired love interest stuff too. Like she is aware of that. She's really smart. She's a good writer. Like she knows what she's doing, but like that also sort of puts like a lot of trust in the reader to also like understand that. And I think because she's a woman like writing in YA, I don't think people always like give her the benefit of the doubt. Almost like like the things that make this story special, the fact that like she's aware of what she's doing, like she knows what like archetype she's playing into. Yeah, it's kind of like what you were saying about this being a story written in first person and the conflation of Jude as the 17-year-old narrator and an adult woman who like wrote her and who's like an experienced, successful author. I see that a lot in fan reviews, like Jude's thoughts are Holly Black's like intentions. And I feel like that really does these books and Holly Black a disservice because she knows exactly what she's doing.
It's sort of an interesting thing. So I have not read A Court of Thorns and Roses, and so my experience of it is largely through references I see on TikTok.
Yeah, that must be interesting because I actually read that before I was on TikTok, so it must be so weird to hear. Yeah, that must be a weird experience. Interesting.
But for me, what I find really interesting about Book Talk is how it is sort of this very distilled glimpse at a certain type of reader, not to say that it's like monolithic, because obviously it's not, but the way that at least people who talk about Book Talk conceptualize it, it does seem to be sort of a lot more homogeneous than, I mean, that's the thing that people talk about a lot is sort of the homogeneity of Book Talk, whether or not that's deserved. I know you've done videos talking about how it's not as homogeneous as people say it is. But sort of taking that back to this thing that you were saying before about you having a sort of concern about the state of YA and about how a lot of YA can be written with this sort of moralistic tone that's very sort of simple or like this is, how you should be kind of thing. What I find really interesting is that for me, my experience of YA, especially YA fantasy and science fiction, is that some of the most experimental and boundary pushing work that I've read in genre fiction has come from YA, especially in terms of like queer representation or like BIPOC representation or things that like people are willing to push boundaries a lot more in YA, I feel like, than in many other sort of more traditional adult genres. But I also think that what's really interesting too is that this thing that you're saying about YA, there's a big, like in the litfic critical community, people have a very similar concern. I find a lot of
really,
yeah,
that's interesting. I'm sort of like on the periphery of litfic, kind of mostly poking fun at it, and not really like in the like what kind of books are they saying that about, or like just, I guess what kind of trends? I'm curious.
Well, it's a very similar thing where I mean, one thing about the litfic community is that the critical community in surrounding litfic tends to be a little bit more focused on books that are sort of innovative craft-wise rather than ones that lots of people are reading. So there is a difference there, but just how it's actually not the critics that I hear having this concern, but rather the writers, because a lot of my friends are writers and I've talked to a lot of different writers on the show, and writers will say how it's really strange that lately a lot of reviews and critiques of literary fiction are a lot more centered around like, is this character likable rather than is this character compelling? Or like, is this story one that has a good moral message rather than is it one?
Oh, geez.
And so a lot of people blame it on sort of like the, like, I don't know, Hollywood Marvel movie phenomenon kind of thing, or the sort of more regressive people who are complaining are just going to say, oh, people are stupid now. But I think that there is something to it where, I don't know if it's just like sort of where we are going as a society, that we want something that's a little bit neater in terms of how we understand our artwork. We don't necessarily want, as a broader society, are we interested in art that's challenging or art that is complicated? Although then the question for me is like, did we ever?
That's a little alarming to hear. I feel like, again, I read some, okay, I'm trying to like, it's not that I don't like lit fic. I'm a little impatient with like kind of the community vibe of it, especially like coming from Book Talk, because a lot of it I feel like is kind of prioritizing like kind of like intellectual posturing. But I don't feel, but all that to say, I'm surprised and concerned that like this is a conversation and like a worry that's happening there as well. Because like from my perspective, I do sort of see lit fic as kind of the last bastion of like you were saying, like this focus on like craft and like exploration and like fine art. So to hear that like, yeah, every kind of niche art community I'm involved in is sort of having an iteration of the same conversation. I honestly feel like I think we've forgotten that like consuming things is not the way to be any kind of person. Like, I don't know, like if that's because like we live in such a consumerist culture that it's like our primary like mode of like interacting with the world, or if like we're so siloed and like away from everyone else that like it is like just the most natural. But like it's almost like people are like increasingly looking at art like this is my opportunity to be a good or bad person. Like consuming this art is like my opportunity to like display to the world like what kind of person I am, and also to like police like what other kind of people are. Not even talking about like the writing itself, but like did you read it, and like what did you think about it? And there's like a right or wrong answer to that. Yeah, that's interesting that that's happening in the lit fic criticism like community as well, because it's happening in every criticism community that I'm part of too.
Yeah, that what you just said is exactly the kind of thing that some of my more lit fic oriented friends have talked about, is how, and again, like I'm not sure to what degree people in general were ever like complex or nuanced readers, because I kind of don't think people were ever better or worse or smarter or dumber.
No,
right?
I agree.
But that the sort of overall I want to say zeitgeist, but that's probably not the right word. But just this sort of overarching attitude among readers now is that the books you read are not so much that you are engaging with them as a work of art, but rather that you are using the books that you've read to build a persona that you can explain your identity of, which I have always found a really interesting kind of two-edged thing. Because on the one hand, I think that for better or worse, identity and identity politics are a part of our culture to a greater degree than they ever have been. And I think that for me and for many people who are of a more marginalized identity, there's something very liberating about that. And it gives the opportunity for discussion and discourse that just wasn't possible 10, 20 years ago. But I think that there is also another side to that where it also becomes very easy to become reductive about things like that. And where people, instead of wanting to use this opportunity of talking about identity as a way of connecting, it's more like I want to use this identity discourse to show what team I'm on kind of thing. Like it feels more performative than discursive. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And that is like a thing about, I think that being like a creator, like creating like bookish content has sort of forced me to like realize kind of the hard way that like, and I think, yeah, I have a responsibility for like the kind of books that I talk about on my page. Like I don't want to talk about like difficult books carelessly, but I am aware that like people like begin to, regardless of like your own kind of, like people will like associate you with certain pieces of media and sort of like ascribe that to like your online like persona that you craft for yourself, like for better or for worse. And that can be really cool and powerful, but it can also be difficult because like when like problematic elements are exposed, it's almost like you're sort of, you've tethered yourself to it. Like you've attached your brand to this brand, and sort of you're all kind of on the hook together. It's a fraught way to engage with art. And I understand, like you were saying, like, I mean, we're having like conversations now that were impossible to have 10, 20 years ago. And that's great. But, yeah, it can be difficult sometimes as well.
I find this moment in artistic, not just books, but just art in general, this moment in artistic history to be one of the, I mean, maybe this is just because of how old I am now that like I'm more aware of things now. But for me, this is a really exciting time in art and literature because I feel like there is actually a lot of innovation happening in a lot of different ways where people are combining genres in new ways. People are finding ways to incorporate different kinds of representation into art and literature in ways that we really haven't seen in America before. And that's really exciting to me. But there's also this way in which it's a little bit hard to approach any of these conversations with a desire to be nuanced because not everybody wants that. And indeed, a lot of times it feels like very few people want that, you know? And it's like, I have basically no sympathy for people who talk about like, oh, the woke mob, or like, you can't say anything these days, because that's obviously bullshit. But I think that what is true is that we are in a time where people seem to be more interested in picking teams than in talking about things in any kind of an analytical way. And that makes it a little bit hard because, like, as you were saying, especially in a medium like TikTok, where you have at most 3 minutes to talk about something in a single video, it's really hard to bring any kind of complexity and nuance in just 3 minutes. And so people will make up their minds about what they think you're saying rather than what you are saying.
Yep. That's a really difficult thing about like TikTok in particular, because of how quickly like the discourse moves, and that's been kind of the single most frustrating thing like for me as a creator is like I really value precise language. That's one of the reasons I'm nervous about talking off the cuff like this, because like I challenge myself to say what I'm trying to say, like trying to like use like the literal English words to like come as close to like what I'm actually trying to say as possible. And I feel like I've gotten better at that. And so I've really had a difficult time adjusting to, no matter how good at that I get, people are going to be swiping through and see my face and like see a straw man, and they hear like a couple words and then they think they understand what I'm saying, and it's clear from their comments that they don't always, and that's been, I think that's a frustrating challenge of TikTok in particular. Sorry, I didn't mean to like start like grousing about, I like BookTok a lot. I think, and like you said, I like books so much, and I think that there's like things I'm concerned about in this like current moment, but also like you're saying, I think there's more happening than ever. It's not easier, but like writing a book is more accessible to anyone than it ever has been in history. Writing a book and like getting it out there, like even if you don't want to self-publish, you can just write a book and put it on AO3. And if you're savvy, if you have a community of people who are like interested in your stuff, you can promote it and people will read it. And I think that is so cool. So I'm sorry I was taking a like kind of a negative turn. I do have like some big frustrations with TikTok right now, but overall I love books, and this is like the best time I think in like history to be like a person who loves books. There's so much great stuff out there. So I want to say that so I don't like come off sounding like way negative, because that's not really a true reflection of my feelings. I have frustrations like everyone else, but
I think that's, I mean, I think it's completely legitimate. You know, I think that if one wanted to make any kind of any comment or statement on what the world is like right now, you know, you couldn't be totally positive or totally negative, right? Like there's frustrations, there's also opportunities. TikTok, I find, is such an interesting microcosm of the way discourse happens in general, not just on the internet even, but even in person these days. Things seem different. Part of that, of course, is that I'm older and paying more attention now, but I think there's also something that is sort of qualitatively different about discourse now than even when I was a younger adult. And in many ways that's exciting because, like we both have said, like conversations are happening now that never happened before, at least not in my lifetime, or even like the older people that I've talked with, like my parents' age or things like that. Those are people just didn't talk about stuff before. But I think especially, you know, to bring this back to the book that we're talking about, there is a sort of way that readers in general might have always been sort of surface level in their understanding of artwork. But when you want to have more of a fan community or a critical community, there would maybe have been more of an expectation of more analytical engagement. And I think a book like this one can be very rewarding if you want to apply that sort of framework or lens to understanding this book. But it's not necessarily easy to find out there, that kind of discussion, you know?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of tension between my background, which is kind of like what you were, so I did my undergrad degree in studio art and like fine art. And so that has really informed the way that I approach, in fact, more than anything, like it's foundational to like how I approach like talking about books on my platform. And so like in art school, and it's like, I didn't go to like, I say that it's not, I went to like a little dinky state school. So it's not like super talented. It's just like a bunch of like regular, like working class kids for the most part. And you sort of enter critique with the, you bring your piece, like you did the assignment and you put it on the wall and you enter critique with, and like it might go badly, like people might not like your piece, but you all sort of like signed this like social contract that you're like, you are going to engage with it sincerely. And so because that's my background, like I get so frustrated, like especially I think maybe that's why I feel so strongly about this book in particular, because it's okay if you don't like it. Like it's fine if you don't like it, but I see so much like careless dismissal of it that seems to me like the result of approaching it. You didn't sign a social contract. Like you didn't agree to approach this like with an open mind. You went in with expectations, and of course your expectations were met because that's what you were looking for. And so and that is like the thing in book criticism world that I routinely get like the most frustrated by. And that's like a goal for myself is to like approach even like the silliest, like least respected stuff, like with like a critique circle, like frame of mind. Cause I feel like that is the way I do that selfishly, because I want to get the most that I can out of art. And I believe strongly that that's the way to do it. So I get frustrated when I see like people cheating themselves out of that experience because they're like approaching like a thing that is like traditionally looked down upon, like YA written for teen girls, like with a certain set of expectations. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think a book like this is interesting because, like I mentioned a while back, when I was a teenager, I would have read this book really differently. Mm-hmm. But I also think that I would have enjoyed it when I was a teenager. And I think that it is quite possible to take this book just as like a fantasy court intrigue story that is as like anything else that I read when I was a kid, right? That, maybe it's more violent in certain places than what was being published in the late 80s, at least, of the stuff that I was, well, I mean, I guess I can't even say that because I was just talking about Thomas Covenant. but of the books that I was reading back then that I was taking, just as like a fantasy adventure kind of thing that's fun, you can read this book on that level and have an enjoyable time. But I think what's interesting is that there's more going on under the hood than that. And I think it may actually be because of the fact that it has that sort of, it's not, I don't want to say standard because that sounds kind of condescending, but that's the word that comes to mind, sort of standard fantasy plot architecture to it, that I think people just in general, unless a fantasy or science fiction book has something obvious about it, like in terms of writing style or central theme to it, that makes it really obvious that it's making some kind of commentary, people just kind of tend to take things at face value. Where here, and I think this is sort of what you were saying before, I think the fact that it's written in the style that it's written is itself a commentary. And that's not a commentary that you could understand without, one, a good understanding of how language and literary tropes work, but also two, like what YA is in general. Like you have to, in order to see the fact that this is making a commentary on these things, you would have to already know what YA fantasy is like in general.
Right. I'm really coming around to that point. I agree. I'm really coming around to what you said. Like, is this appropriate for like young audiences? Not in the sense that, you know, like the content and tone of it, but like, are they going to have the tools? That's really interesting. I never thought about it like that before. Like, are they going to have the tools to like be able to parse like the commentary on the genre that she's writing? And I don't really think so. But I think it's like, for the most part, like I'm sure so, like some teens are like just really voracious readers and like probably read like a lot of paranormal romance too young, and they probably pick up on some of this stuff. But like you said, I think that's a really cool observation. I also think I would have read this book as a teen and enjoyed it. It's in the same way. I don't think I would have like totally been able to like understand all like the themes that Black was trying to explore. But I think I really would have enjoyed it as like a tight little fantasy court politics story on its own. Like the intricacies just of that alone, I think there's like a lot of merit to that. And I think that's good and cool. I think that makes it like good art. I think that's kind of what it's all about. I don't know. I've always kind of said, I think that like the best art is kind of about two things at once, and can be enjoyed on two levels at once. I think that this is a good example of that.
Yeah. So, we're getting close to time. The last question I always like to ask everyone is if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah. I'm on the trend of this. Are you familiar with Boy Genius, with the indie rock supergroup?
Yeah.
They just put out a new EP. Are we still calling them EPs? I'm not totally sure. They put out like a single. They put out 3 tracks. It's called The Record. Boy Genius is the supergroup. It's Phoebe Bridgers, Lucy Dacus, and Julian Baker. They put out a 3-track EP called The Record, and there's one track on it called True Blue. It's about sort of a mature, lived-in kind of love, a fine, stout love, as Elizabeth Bennet would say. It's just like a really mature little love song. I love the whole record, but that song in particular, I've listened to about 100 times since it came out a couple of weeks ago. So I'd say that's my answer.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really had a good time.
Of course, I did too. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase copies of The Cruel Prince. There's also a link to Mel's TikTok page where you can find all of their excellent book discussions. I highly recommend it. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shea Aguinaldo. I do hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, help spread the word by recommending it to the podcast lover in your life, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that. And you can find all of the show's contact information, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back next month with a new conversation, so do be sure to come back for that. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.